Mike Harper has always considered himself a rational person. He was a successful lawyer who believed only in facts and logic. That night he was returning home after a difficult case, tired but satisfied with his victory in court. The road was deserted, and Mike turned on the radio to keep himself awake while driving. Suddenly, a strange noise came from the speakers, followed by an eerie voice. "Your time has come, Michael Harper." Mike shuddered and turned off the radio. "Bullshit," he muttered, chalking it up to fatigue. Suddenly, a thick fog enveloped the car. Mike slowed down, trying to see the road. He didn't notice how the asphalt under his wheels changed to a dirt path. When the fog cleared a little, Mike was horrified to realize that he was in the middle of a huge cemetery. His car had disappeared, and he was standing between old, mossy tombstones. "This is some kind of ridiculous dream," Mike said to himself, trying to stay calm. He started walking, looking for a way out. Hours passed, but the landscape did not change. Wherever Mike turned, there were only graves, tombs, and old trees with bare branches. The moon hanging over the cemetery seemed unnaturally large and red. Suddenly, Mike heard the sound of footsteps behind him. Turning around, he saw a tall figure in a black hooded cloak. It held a huge scythe in one bony hand and a long curved dagger in the other. Terror gripped Mike. He started running, weaving between the graves. But no matter how fast he ran, the cloaked figure inexorably approached, not quickening his pace. Mike ran until his lungs began to burn. He hid behind a large tombstone, trying to catch his breath. When he looked out, the figure was nowhere to be seen. With a sigh of relief, Mike turned around and came face to face with death. A naked skull with glowing red eyes stared at him from under a hood. "Who are you? What do you want?" Mike shouted, backing away. Death silently raised his dagger. On the blade, Mike saw his name engraved in ancient runes. "No, I'm not ready. I have so much to do," Mike pleaded. But Death was relentless. The dagger came down, and Mike felt a searing pain in his chest. Everything went black. Mike woke up, gasping for breath. He was lying on the damp ground, surrounded by tombstones. The fog was spreading between the graves. In the distance, he saw a familiar figure in a black cloak. It happened again and again. Mike ran, hid, begged, but each time it ended with a dagger in his chest. And each time he woke up to start all over again. He lost track of time, days, weeks, years. Mike didn't know anymore. He tried to stay awake, looking for ways to outwit death, but in vain. One day, exhausted by the endless chase, Mike simply stopped and turned to face his pursuer. "I'm ready," he said tiredly. "But tell me, why? Why am I being punished?" For the first time, Death spoke. His voice was like the rustling of fallen leaves. "This is not a punishment, Michael Harper. This is a lesson. You've always thought you were in control of your life, but there are things that are beyond human logic and will." "And now what?" Mike asked. "Now you have a choice," replied Death. "Accept your fate or run away from it forever." Mike looked at the dagger in Death's hand for a long time, then he nodded slowly. This time, when the dagger came down, there was no pain. Instead, Mike felt his soul being freed from the burden of fear and doubt. He opened his eyes and saw that he was standing in a green meadow under a clear sky. The cemetery had disappeared. "Welcome home," he heard a voice behind him, but it was no longer a horrible figure with a scythe, but a light creature holding out his hand. Lisa Carter has always been a daddy's girl. When Robert Carter died of cancer 3 years ago, her world fell apart. Since then, she has visited his grave every year on the day he died. This year, her work at the law firm kept Lisa up late. She arrived at the cemetery after sunset. The sky was overcast with heavy clouds, portending a storm. Lisa walked along the familiar path, holding a bouquet of lilies, her father's favorite flower. She stopped at his grave and laid the flowers down. "Hi, Dad," Lisa whispered. I'm sorry I'm so late. This year has been hard without you." Suddenly she heard a strange sound, as if something was scratching the ground beneath her feet. Lisa tensed, looking around. The cemetery was empty and eerily quiet. The sound repeated, louder. It was coming from her father's grave. Lisa's heart sank. She stepped back as the ground on the grave began to move. The gravestone cracked, and a horrible creature crawled out of the ground. It had her father's body, but it was distorted and mixed with parts of other corpses. One arm was bony, the other swollen and rotten. The face was half her father's and half someone else's exposed skull. "Lee, for—" The creature wheezed, turning its head toward her. There was something familiar in its eyes, but distorted by indescribable horror. Lisa screamed and ran. She could hear the monster chasing her, hobbling on different legs and making inhuman sounds. She ran between the graves, stumbling in the darkness. The rain began to pour down like a bucket, turning the ground into a slippery swamp. Lisa fell, hitting a tombstone painfully. Looking back, she saw the creature approaching. In a flash of lightning, Lisa could see other graves opening up. From them crawled the same horrific creatures, mixed parts of different corpses reaching for her. Lisa got up and ran to the old cemetery chapel. She managed to run inside and lock the door a moment before the creatures reached the entrance. She could hear them scratching at the door from the outside, trying to break through. Amid the grunts and moans, Lisa could make out a voice that sounded like her father's. "Lisa, let me in. I've missed you so much." "No, you're not my father," Lisa screamed, pressing herself against the far wall of the chapel. The door cracked under the onslaught of the creatures. Lisa frantically looked for a way out, but there was none. She noticed an old tombstone in the corner and tried to hide behind it. When the door finally gave way, Lisa saw a horde of horrible creatures crawling into the chapel. In front was the one who had once been her father. "Daughter, go," he wheezed, reaching out for her. "We want you to join us." Lisa closed her eyes, feeling the cold, rotten fingers at her throat. She thought of her life, of unfinished business, of friends and family she would never see again. The creature that had once been her father pulled her closer. Lisa felt unbearable pain as the creature began to tear her body apart. Her screams mingled with the thunder outside. In the last moments of her life, Lisa thought she was seeing her father's real face through the creature's horrific mask. It was sad and guilty. "I'm sorry, darling," a familiar voice whispered before the darkness swallowed Lisa forever. In the morning, a watchman found Lisa's mutilated body in the chapel. The police could not explain the numerous footprints of different people around and the strange teeth and claw marks on the victim's body. Robert Carter's grave was empty and torn open from the inside, and around it were scattered white lilies. The daughter's last gift to her father, before the horror of that night joined them forever in the darkness of the afterlife. Three friends, Jason, Emily, and Kevin, decided to test their courage by playing scarecrows in the old abandoned Oak Hill Cemetery. They came there late in the evening, when dusk had already enveloped the tilted tombstones and old crypts. "Those who are afraid, drive!" Jason shouted, and Emily reluctantly closed her eyes and started counting. Jason and Kevin ran in different directions. Kevin hid behind a large angelic tombstone, and Jason decided to climb into the old Anderson family crypt. Suddenly, the ground under Kevin's feet sagged, and he fell into a deep hole, screaming. It turned out to be an old, dilapidated grave. Hearing the scream, Emily rushed to help, but before she could get there, the ground sank beneath her. The girl found herself in another pit, deep and wet. Jason, hearing his friend's screams, ran out of the crypt. He was cautiously approaching the place where Kevin had disappeared, but suddenly the ground opened up under him. The boy rolled down into a dark cavity underground. All three found themselves in different underground chambers, connected by narrow tunnels. They were screaming, trying to hear each other, but the sound echoed off the earthen walls. The children tried to get out by scratching at the walls of the pits, but the wet soil crumbled under their fingers. They tried to crawl through the tunnels, but they often ended in dead ends or dangerous collapses. Hours passed. Phones did not work underground. The darkness and cold chilled them to the bone. The children screamed and called for help, but no one heard them. Suddenly, Emily heard a strange sound, as if something was scratching the ground nearby. "Who's there?" she whispered in a trembling voice. An eerie hissing sound came in response. In the dim light coming through the crack above, Emily saw a pale hand crawling out of the ground. In the other cells, Jason and Kevin also heard strange noises. Horrified, they watched as dead bodies began to rise from the ground, pale, deformed, and with empty eyes. Jason fought off bony hands reaching for him from all sides. "Emily! Kevin, where are you?" Emily pressed herself against the wall as several of the dead slowly approached her. "Please," she sobbed, "someone help us." But no one came to help. The children's screams faded, swallowed up by the darkness of the dungeon. And up in the Oak Hill Cemetery, the wind swayed the branches of the old oaks, hiding the last desperate pleas for salvation.